The following formula had been perfected at Stalingrad just months earlier. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that would become the template for victory. The 5th Tank Army struck from the north while the 51st Army attacked from the south, their armored spearheads racing across the frozen steppe to meet behind German lines. Within 4 days, they had encircled the entire German 6th Army. 330,000 men trapped in a steel cage with no escape. General Friedrich Paulus, once confident in his fortress city, watched helplessly as his army starved and froze. By February 1943, the 6th Army had ceased to exist. The Soviets thought they had cracked the code of modern warfare. Their double envelopment had crushed entire German armies, torn through 400 miles of enemy territory, and seemed unstoppable. Then they reached a narrow strip of land between two seas, and their war machine ground to a bloody halt. What they found there would cost them 114,000 casualties and rewrite the rules of fortress warfare forever. The double envelopment became the Red Army's signature move. Strike from both flanks simultaneously, race to link up behind enemy lines, then systematically destroy everything caught in the trap. It was surgical, devastating, and seemingly unstoppable. Soviet commanders had used this tactic to liberate Rostov-on-Don, smash through the Donbas, and tear through 400 miles of German-held territory across the Kuban region. Village after village fell to the same relentless formula. German commanders learned to fear the sight of Soviet armor appearing on their flanks. It meant encirclement, destruction, and death. But when the Red Army reached the Taman Peninsula, everything changed. Here, geography itself conspired against the Soviets. The peninsula stretched like a narrow finger between the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, a natural bottleneck barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. Swamps choked the northern approaches. Mountains guarded the south. There were no flanks to turn, no rear areas to exploit. The Germans had found the one place on the Eastern Front where Soviet tactical superiority meant nothing. The double envelopment that had worked so brilliantly at Stalingrad was impossible here. There was simply nowhere to go around. General Erwin Janecka understood this advantage perfectly. His 17th Army, 400,000 men strong, had spent months transforming the peninsula into what Hitler proudly called Fortress Taman. The centerpiece was the Blue Line, a defensive system that made the Atlantic Wall look primitive by comparison. Behind earthen berms and flooded marshlands, German engineers had constructed the most formidable fortifications on the Eastern Front. 2,860 artillery pieces, over 100 tanks, 300 aircraft, and bunker complexes connected by miles of concrete reinforced tunnels. The engineering marvel of the Blue Line defied comprehension. German construction battalions had moved millions of tons of earth, creating artificial hills and valleys that channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones. They flooded entire districts, turning farmland into impassable swamps. Concrete bunkers, each requiring weeks to construct, were positioned with mathematical precision to provide overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank ditches, some 20 feet deep, snaked across the landscape like scars. At the heart of this fortress system stood a single building that would become legendary among Soviet soldiers, the Red House. This unremarkable apartment complex in Novorossiysk had been transformed into a concrete nightmare. German engineers had reinforced every wall with steel and concrete, connected every basement with tunnels, and turned each window into a firing port. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Sniper positions commanded every street. The building had become a living weapon designed for one purpose: to bleed attackers white. Stalin's patience had limits. He gave his commanders 30 days to break through. No extensions, no excuses. Drive the Germans out or join them in the rubble. The Blue Line's defensive genius lay in its layered complexity. The northern sector forced attackers through narrow channels between impassable swamps, natural killing grounds where a single machine gun could pin down entire regiments. The central sector offered 20 miles of seemingly open ground, but German engineers had seeded it with the densest minefields on the Eastern Front. Soviet intelligence estimated over 100,000 mines in this sector alone. Behind the mines waited two massive bunker complexes, their concrete walls 3 feet thick, connected by communication trenches that allowed defenders to shift forces invisibly. The southern approaches through Novorossiysk presented different challenges. Here, the Germans had turned urban warfare into an art form. Entire city blocks became interconnected fortresses. Basements were connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to appear and disappear like ghosts. Streets were barricaded with rubble and mines. Every building became a potential strongpoint. Every intersection a trap. Behind the Blue Line, more defensive positions waited in depth. The Bucharest Line, Berlin Line, Munich, Stuttgart, and Ulm positions. The Germans had even constructed something called the Little Gothic Line, running from Temryuk to the Black Sea. Each position was designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones, while buying time for the next line to prepare. For 7 months, a small Soviet beachhead had clung to life at Novorossiysk. The Red Army called it the Little Land, a pocket of resistance barely 2 miles wide. German attacks had hammered this position relentlessly, launching over 50 separate assaults. Yet Colonel General WW2 Petrov's forces refused to break. Now this stubborn foothold would become the launching point for the main assault. Among Petrov's most unusual assets was the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. The Germans had given these Soviet aviators a different name, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. 200 young women, most barely into their 20s, flew obsolete Po-2 biplanes converted into bombers. These canvas and plywood trainers from the 1920s seemed laughably inadequate against modern defenses, but the Night Witches had developed tactics that turned weakness into strength. The Po-2 biplane was never designed for combat. Originally built as a training aircraft, it had a maximum speed of just 94 miles per hour, slower than most cars on a highway. Its wooden frame and canvas covering offered no protection against enemy fire. It could carry only 350 pounds of bombs. Yet these limitations became advantages in the hands of skilled pilots. The aircraft was so slow that German fighters often stalled, trying to match its speed. Its wooden construction made it nearly invisible to radar. The Night Witches had perfected a terrifying technique. Flying at low altitude, they would approach their targets with engines running normally. Then, at the last moment, they would cut their engines and glide silently toward their objective. German soldiers below heard only a soft whooshing sound, like wind through trees, before bombs began falling. The psychological effect was devastating. September 10th, 1943. 200 Soviet guns erupted simultaneously as darkness fell over Novorossiysk. The bombardment was merely the overture. Katyusha rocket launchers added their distinctive shriek to the symphony of destruction. High above, the Night Witches climbed to 1,200 meters in their ancient biplanes. At the predetermined moment, they cut their engines. In eerie silence, they glided through the darkness like ghosts. The first bombs struck ammunition dumps near the harbor. Secondary explosions lit the night sky in brilliant orange and white. The October cement factory erupted in flames. German searchlights swept frantically across the darkness, hunting for targets that moved like shadows. When the beams finally caught the slow-moving biplanes, anti-aircraft guns opened up with murderous intensity. A German night fighter struck without warning. 4 Po-2s caught fire instantly, spiraling earthward like falling stars. 8 young women burned alive in their cockpits, trapped by flames and gravity. The survivors pressed their attack with grim determination, dropping their remaining bombs before limping back to base, with aircraft riddled by flak. Behind them came 150 more aircraft from the 4th Air Army. turning the night sky into a storm of fire and steel. Soviet torpedo boats knifed through the harbor darkness, their crews ignoring German ships to fire directly into jetties and pier installations. Following them came cutters packed with assault troops. 3 battalions of naval infantry and NKVD soldiers hitting the docks under withering fire. At 3:15 a.m., the main ground assault began. The Western Group burst from the Mizkako beachhead, that stubborn little land that had survived 7 months of German fury. The Eastern Group pushed through mountain approaches north of the city. Both groups ran directly into prepared German positions. The defenders had been waiting. Within hours, 2 of the 3 Soviet assault groups were shattered. The naval infantry and NKVD battalions, caught in the open by concentrated machine gun fire, were torn apart. Bodies floated in the harbor, their blood mixing with oil from burning fuel dumps. Only the 1,339th Rifle Regiment managed to secure a few blocks near the harbor. But by nightfall, they were surrounded and bleeding out. The 1,337th Rifle Regiment fought desperately to reach them, clawing forward meter by meter through German defensive fire. Every street became a battlefield. Every building required individual assault. By dawn, they had linked up with survivors of the 1,339th, but at terrible cost. Of the 2,400 men who had started the assault, fewer than 800 remained combat effective. Then came the breakthrough. At first light on September 11th, the Eastern Group, reinforced with T-34 tanks, smashed into the October cement factory. The German line cracked. Soviet armor poured through the gap, racing to link up with rifle regiments fighting in the city. For the first time in 7 months, the blue line had been pierced. The Red House stood directly in their path. German machine gunners had turned every window into a death trap. Soviet assault waves were caught in the open, cut down before they could reach the building. Artillery crews trying to wheel guns into direct fire positions were picked off by snipers before they could fire a shot. The building seemed impregnable. Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns moved up, methodically. Shell by shell, they began dismantling the Red House, punching 76mm holes through concrete walls. Dust and smoke filled the air as the building slowly disintegrated. But the Germans had built deep. They continued firing from basements, from tunnels connecting the ruins to other positions. Finally, Soviet combat engineers crawled forward with explosive charges. Under covering fire from tanks, they reached the building's foundation, placing charges at critical structural points. The charges detonated like underground thunder. The Red House collapsed in on itself, burying the defenders in tons of concrete and steel. When the dust settled, nothing remained but rubble. Up north, the 9th Army launched its own assault through the marshes. The terrain made breakthrough impossible. Channels between swamps were too narrow, too well defended. But the attack served its purpose, preventing Germans from shifting reserves south to Novorossiysk. German high command recognized reality. On September 4th, Hitler had already authorized Field Marshal von Manstein to begin evacuating the Taman Peninsula, if necessary. With Soviet tanks loose in Novorossiysk, the 17th Army started its withdrawal across the Kerch Straits to Crimea. It would be orderly, methodical, and costly for anyone trying to stop them. September 14th brought the 56th Army's assault on the central sector, straight into the most heavily fortified section of the Blue Line. Soviet tanks rolled forward under direct fire from German 88mm guns. They reached the minefield edges and stopped. Engineers rushed forward to clear passages, blowing gaps in the deadly fields. But the moment tanks pushed through cleared lanes, German anti-tank guns zeroed in. Every tank that exited the gap burst into flames. Infantry, cut off from armor support, went to ground. The attack collapsed. September 15th brought renewed assault with everything the Soviets could muster. This time, tanks broke through forward German trenches. To the south, the 18th Army captured Sugarhead Mountain, opening approaches to Novorossiysk itself. The German 4th Mountain Division, threatened with encirclement, began pulling back. The Blue Line was crumbling. By nightfall, on September 16th, Soviet soldiers and Black Sea Fleet Marines raised the red flag over Novorossiysk. The port city was free after 7 months of occupation. The Ninth Army fought a different war entirely. Chest deep in stinking marsh water, Soviet soldiers waded forward, using inflated inner tubes to stay afloat. They pursued the fleeing German army through terrain that seemed designed to swallow entire divisions. Romanian mountain infantry and dismounted cavalry had turned every piece of dry ground into a killing zone. At Wolf's Gate Pass, 2 days of savage fighting in narrow ravines left bodies floating downstream, clogging channels with the dead. The Germans fell back to prepared positions in rehearsed succession, making the Soviets pay for every meter. Soviet tanks from the 18th Army punched through to Anapa on September 20th, reaching the Black Sea coast. After one more day of street fighting, the port fell. But across the Kerch Straits, German evacuation ships worked around the clock. The race was on. The Black Sea Fleet landed small assault parties between lagoons and marshes, trying to cut narrow coastal roads. Every landing met fierce resistance. The Germans couldn't afford to lose those roads. They were lifelines to survival. On September 25th, the Soviets played their biggest card. 8,500 men came ashore near Salt Lake in a massive, amphibious assault designed to crush the German evacuation from behind. Their objective was Taman City. If they could take it, they would slam the door on the German escape route. For 2 days, the landing force battled through German rearguards, supported by every aircraft the Black Sea Fleet could muster. Meanwhile, another 1,600 men landed west of Temryuk. 2 more days of savage fighting followed before Temryuk finally fell on September 27th. The German 3rd Minesweeping Flotilla hauled overland from the Baltic Sea on 64-wheeled transports, orchestrated the evacuation with ruthless efficiency. Every night, ships shuttled back and forth across the straits. Men, vehicles, horses, supplies. Everything that could be saved was saved. The numbers were staggering. 255,000 Axis soldiers evacuated, 21,000 vehicles, 1,800 guns, 74,000 horses. Even as Soviet artillery found the range and aircraft bombed the ports, the Germans kept loading. The evacuation became a masterpiece of military logistics under fire. The 97th Light Division and 4th Mountain Division held the final perimeter around the evacuation ports. These were elite troops, veterans of mountain warfare in Norway and the Caucasus. They had constructed a series of concentric defensive rings, each one designed to buy precious hours for the evacuation fleet. German artillery on the Crimean shore provided supporting fire across the water, their shells screaming overhead to burst among advancing Soviet forces. On October 9th, at 4:47 a.m., Generals Rudolf Conrad and Erwin Jennecke stepped aboard the last boat. Behind them, German demolition teams triggered their final charges. Fuel dumps erupted in towering columns of flame. Ammunition stores detonated in chain reactions that shook the earth for miles. Port facilities collapsed into twisted wreckage. The Germans had left nothing useful behind. When Soviet soldiers entered the abandoned positions, they found only destruction and a landscape scarred by months of warfare. It was a bittersweet victory. The Soviets had reclaimed the Taman Peninsula and sealed the door to the Caucasus forever, but they had been humiliated by their inability to stop the German evacuation. The losses told the real story. German casualties exceeded 10,000, including 4 division commanders and 36,000 wounded. Romanian troops accounted for another 1,600 losses, but Soviet losses dwarfed them all. 114,000 casualties, over 40,000 fallen soldiers. The arithmetic of victory was written in blood. Hitler recognized his soldiers' achievement with a new decoration, the Kuban Shield, awarded to all personnel who had served in the Taman Peninsula campaign. For the Wehrmacht, it represented one of their last successful defensive operations on the Eastern Front. The 17th Army had escaped intact to fight another day, preserving experienced troops and equipment for future battles. In the abandoned German positions, Soviet soldiers found a sign that made their victory even more bitter. Here, the Iron Crosses grow. It was a grim reminder that courage and sacrifice existed on both sides of the conflict, and that victory often came at a price that made celebration impossible. The Red House was gone, reduced to rubble and memory. But its legacy remained, a testament to the terrible arithmetic of war, where victory and defeat could be measured in the same currency: human lives. The fortress that was supposed to hold for a year had fallen in 30 days, but it had consumed an army in the process. The Taman Peninsula campaign demonstrated both the evolution of Soviet military capabilities and their limitations. The Red Army had learned to coordinate complex operations involving multiple services: Army, Navy, and Air Force working together with unprecedented precision. Yet they still struggled with the fundamental challenge of reducing heavily fortified positions without massive casualties. For the German Wehrmacht, the campaign represented a strategic withdrawal, executed with professional competence under impossible circumstances. They had held far longer than anyone had a right to expect, inflicted disproportionate casualties on their attackers, and escaped with their forces largely intact. It was a tactical masterpiece wrapped in strategic defeat. The peninsula fell silent at last, its swamps and ruins holding the secrets of one of the war's most brutal campaigns. The fortress that ate 114,000 soldiers alive had finally been conquered, but at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Taman Peninsula campaign remains one of World War II's most overlooked battles, a brutal clash that demonstrated both the evolution of Soviet military power and the deadly effectiveness of German defensive doctrine. While history remembers the great victories and defeats, stories like this remind us that the war was won and lost in countless smaller battles, each one a human tragedy of staggering proportions. This is exactly the kind of untold story we uncover here at WW2pedia. If you want to discover more of these hidden chapters of history, make sure to subscribe to WW2pedia and hit that notification bell, because the most important stories are often the ones that history forgot to tell.